At first light, the ridge was quiet, too quiet for a place that had swallowed so many lives the night before. The grass was still wet with rain, bending under the weight of the humid Pacific air. Somewhere along that narrow spine of ground, a young Marine steadied his breathing, the dirt cool beneath his hands, the silence pressing against his ears. He had been awake for more than a day, but exhaustion was a luxury he could no longer afford. The jungle below him, dense and deceptively still, hid an army 3 times the size of his own. Far to the north, beyond the mist and the faint smell of cordite, lay Henderson Field. It wasn't much to look at, just a strip of crushed coral carved out of the jungle. But the fate of the entire Pacific War balanced on that thin line of earth. If it fell, the Japanese would reclaim the Solomon Islands. And if they reclaimed the Solomons, the path toward Australia and the American lifeline beyond would crack open. On this ridge, 40 Marines stood between survival and catastrophe. And it forces us to ask what gives ordinary men the will to hold steady when the world itself seems ready to collapse. The Pacific in 1942 was a battlefield shaped by momentum, Japanese momentum. From Shanghai to Singapore, their armies had carved an empire through speed, discipline, and a willingness to fight in places where others faltered. In that vast theater, one small island unexpectedly disrupted the arc of their triumph, Guadalcanal. What drew both nations into its jungles was not the island itself, but Henderson Field, a rough airstrip whose value far exceeded its humble appearance. From its runway, American aircraft could cut the lifelines that fed Japan's forward bases and shielded the supply routes linking the United States to Australia. Lose Guadalcanal and the Allies risked losing the entire Southwest Pacific. Lose Henderson Field and Guadalcanal would fall by default. Tokyo understood this with perfect clarity. So did Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, a seasoned officer who had fought in the rugged campaigns of China and Borneo. He believed he knew exactly how to break the American perimeter by striking where the defenders least expected it. His plan called for nearly 3,000 men to navigate choking jungle, steep ravines, and swampy lowlands, marching silently for days until they reached the southern approaches to the American line. When night fell, they would attack. In darkness, Japanese infantry were in their element, but someone on the American side understood the terrain just as well. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson, commander of the 1st Marine Raider Battalion, had spent years fighting in the dense mountains of Nicaragua and studying Japanese operations in China. When he examined the perimeter around Henderson Field on September 9th, he pointed to a narrow grassy ridge running north to south, high ground, offering a direct path to the airstrip. To others, the ridge seemed quiet, almost ideal, as a rest sector for Edson's exhausted raiders and the depleted Marines of the 1st Parachute Battalion. To Edson, it was a doorway to disaster. He moved his 840 Marines onto the ridge on September 11th. On the night of September 12th, the danger revealed itself, and everyone on that ridge understood what came next would decide far more than a patch of jungle. Through the long hours of September 13th, the Marines worked in a tense quiet that felt heavier than any bombardment. Their trenches deepened. Machine gun teams adjusted their fields of fire, and forward observers checked their radios again and again, knowing the coming night would test every inch of ground. Lieutenant Colonel Edson moved calmly among them, his boots sinking into the damp coral soil, offering brief words that held more weight than any speech. One more night, he had told them. As dusk settled, the wind shifted. A cool rain brushed across the ridge, turning the earth slick beneath the Marines' feet. Then far offshore, the thunder of naval guns rolled across the jungle. Japanese destroyers had found their target. Shells tore across the ridge in sheets of fire and concussion, uprooting trees, collapsing fighting holes, and sending fragments of coral slicing through the darkness. Some Marines disappeared in the blasts. Others held each other down in the mud, waiting for the barrage to end. When it did, silence returned, an eerie, suffocating silence, broken only by the distant cries of the wounded. Moments later, the ridge came alive. From the southern tree line, shapes began to move, first shadows, then figures, then a mass of soldiers advancing with a unified roar. Kawaguchi had committed nearly 3,000 men to the assault, and they surged forward in waves crying, Tenno Heika Banzai, as they closed the distance. The ridge erupted with the sharp rhythmic crack of M1 Garands, the steady thunder of machine guns, and the deep thump of mortar rounds arcing overhead. Tracers sliced through the darkness, revealing fleeting glimpses of faces contorted in fury, determination, or fear. Despite the ferocity of the defense, the line bent. On the right flank, a break widened to nearly 200 yards as Japanese infantry slipped through the wire and surged toward Hill 123. But Edson was already moving toward the breach. His presence steadied the Marines. If their commander would walk through a storm of bullets without hesitation, then they could hold the line a little longer. In the chaos, Private First Class Tom Watson, a battery clerk, suddenly thrust into the role of forward observer, lowered himself into a shallow hole and began calling in fire missions. His voice, calm and exact, guided 105mm howitzer shells across the ridge with surgical precision. The counterattack that followed came from Marines who had little left to give. Through midnight, through rain, through exhaustion that bordered on collapse, the Marines held their ground. And when the clock neared 1 in the morning, Kawaguchi hurled everything he had at Hill 123 in one final push. That push would decide the battle. The final assault began shortly after 1 o'clock in the morning, when the rain eased and the moon broke through the thinning clouds. Its pale light washed across the ridge, revealing dark shapes gathering in the jungle below. Kawaguchi had committed his last reserves, 3 battalions converging on Hill 123 in a single desperate thrust. For the Marines crouched in their fighting holes, the sight was both unreal and inevitable. They could feel in the trembling of the ground and the rising chorus of voices that the decisive moment had arrived. When the Japanese troops surged forward, the ridge erupted once more. Machine gun teams fired until their barrels glowed, pulling ammunition from the packs of fallen Marines. Riflemen squeezed every round from their clips, pausing only long enough to wipe the wet mud from their sights. Behind them, the 105mm howitzers fired over open sights, massive guns depressed as far as their crews dared, turning them into giant shotguns of steel and flame. Shells tore through the charging formations at point-blank range, throwing bodies across the slopes and leaving gaping craters in the earth. Still, the Japanese reached the wire. They cut through it in sections, crawling and sprinting toward the fighting holes, where Marines braced for close combat. The next moments dissolved into a blur of mud blood and instinct, some fighting positions filled with bodies, American and Japanese together, until the living had to climb over the dead to keep firing. Voices rose in pain, in command, in fear, but no one left the line. They held because there was nowhere else to go. By 2:30 a.m., the momentum shifted. Japanese officers tried to rally their companies, waving swords or shouting orders, drowned in the chaos, but the formations would not reform. 10 minutes later, the attack collapsed. The shouts faded. The shapes withdrew into the jungle. And for the first time in 2 nights, the ridge grew still. Dawn revealed what the darkness had hidden. The slopes south of Hill 123 were thick with bodies, some piled, where shells had struck, others scattered where men had fallen in the charge. Among the Marines, 57 were dead or missing, and 222 were wounded. Nearly 1 in 3 had become casualties. For Kawaguchi's survivors, the retreat through the jungle was a new ordeal, starvation, disease, and exhaustion consuming what remained of his brigade. One officer later wrote that Guadalcanal was not the name of an island, but the name of the graveyard of the Japanese army. Yet the consequences stretched far beyond those ridges. The failure to seize Henderson Field forced Tokyo to halt its promising New Guinea offensive, diverting precious troops and supplies back toward Guadalcanal. A chance to threaten Australia vanished. The strategic momentum shifted, and the myth of Japanese invincibility forged in the early months of the war cracked on the coral spine the Marines would forever remember as Edson's Ridge. From the American perspective, the stand on Edson's Ridge was more than a tactical victory. It was a revelation. Until Guadalcanal, the Pacific War had been defined by retreat improvisation, and a troubling sense that the United States was racing to catch up with an enemy who had mastered the art of rapid, decisive warfare. But when the smoke cleared over Hill 123, senior commanders realized that something had changed. The Japanese assault had been meticulously planned, supported by seasoned officers, and carried out by units known for their discipline in night fighting. Yet it had failed utterly and visibly. In Washington, military planners studied early reports and saw the implications immediately. If a small force of Marines could absorb, redirect, and finally repel a concentrated Japanese attack on critical terrain, then the broader American strategy rooted in holding key positions until industry and manpower could swing into full motion was viable. Edson's Ridge became proof that the United States could halt the Japanese advance long enough to reverse it. For Tokyo, the defeat sent tremors through the military hierarchy. The Imperial General Headquarters had expected Henderson Field to fall quickly. Its loss was never part of the plan. The failure forced senior leaders to reevaluate their assumptions about American resolve and firepower. Artillery, once considered a weak point of American forces, proved devastatingly accurate. And most unsettling of all, Marine infantry had held positions, even when outnumbered, flanked, and nearly overrun. On the global stage, the consequences were immediate. The halting of the New Guinea offensive relieved pressure on Australia, securing a vital link in the Allied defensive chain. British and Commonwealth strategists noted that Guadalcanal marked the first time a major Japanese ground assault had been decisively stopped. It suggested that Japan's expansion had reached its high water mark and that the tide had begun to turn. For the Marines on that ridge, however, geopolitics meant little in the moment. Their victory was measured not in strategy memos or diplomatic cables, but in the simple and terrible fact that they had survived. Yet history would remember their stand as something far larger, a moment when the trajectory of a world war shifted not because of overwhelming numbers or technology, but because a few hundred exhausted men refused to yield the ground beneath their feet. When morning finally settled across Edson's Ridge, the men who rose from their fighting holes did so slowly, almost reluctantly, as if unsure that the night's fury had truly ended. Their uniforms were torn, their hands blistered, their faces lined with exhaustion that would take years to fade. Yet they had held, against the odds, against the darkness, against the fear that presses hardest when a man is alone with his rifle and his thoughts. They had held. The legacy of that stand began long before historians would name the battle. It lived first in the men themselves. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt, Red Mike Edson, would receive the Medal of Honor, though he never claimed the credit. He insisted that his Marines, those who fought beside him, and those who never made it off the ridge, were the ones who had carried the weight. Private First Class Tom Watson, the battery clerk who became a forward observer in the crucible of necessity, was commissioned on the battlefield for actions that saved the line when it nearly broke. And Corporal Walter Burak, whose tired eyes opened the story of this fight, was later killed in action, awarded the Navy Cross for the courage he had shown on that narrow spine of ground. In the decades that followed, the ridge itself softened under the return of jungle growth. Fighting holes filled in rusted wire vanished beneath layers of green, and the wind that sweeps across Hill 123 now carries more birdsong than battle sound. Yet the shape of the land remains unchanged, still an arrow, still rising, just so stilly, pointing toward the airfield it once guarded. Visitors who walk its length can trace the lines Edson marked, see where machine guns crossed their fields of fire, and imagine the long, terrible nights when the future of the Pacific War hung on that thin terrain. For the Marine Corps, Edson's Ridge became more than a place. It became a lesson. At Marine Corps Recruit Depot, San Diego recruits finished their final test, the Crucible, with a climb up the Reaper, where they stand before a plaque bearing words from Edson's Medal of Honor citation. It is a reminder that battles are not always won by strength or numbers, but by a quiet, unyielding conviction to stand when standing seems impossible. And so the memory endures, not as a tale of glory, but as a testament to steadfastness, to ordinary young men who found something within themselves when history demanded it. If this story resonates with you, I invite you to share your thoughts. What do you believe is the lasting lesson of Edson's Ridge for our world today? And if you value journeys into the moments that shaped our history, consider joining us for the next one.